Hey everyone, welcome to another exciting edition of Primo Nutmeg. Folks, today I have no guest. Yes, for the first time in a long time, I have no guest on the show. It's just going to be me riding solo on a very special edition that I like to call Talking Turkey. I hope that everybody out there is having a great Thanksgiving, that you're visiting with all of your friends and family, and that you're not talking politics. I know over recent years a lot of us have had political debates around Thanksgiving, and that this has really caused some long-lasting problems in families and personal relationships. And you know, when it comes to family, I think that this is really unfortunate and we shouldn't let politics get in the way of our personal relationships. It's really just not that important. To a large degree, partisan politics really is professional wrestling. It's a lot of show, it's a lot of storylines and characters. And to be brutally honest, our opinions really only affect the political landscape so much, especially in the short term. So for that reason, I hope that everybody out there is going to abstain from having any kind of political arguments with your family. It's just not worth it. It's not going to convince anybody. And it most likely only really serves to do damage to relationships. So that's my take on that. But beyond that, Nutmeggers, I did just want to catch up with all of you one last time this November. And I wanted to let you all know that I'm very thankful for your support. I've been doing this show for a little over 4 years now. And as many of you know, when I started out, I was really just hanging out with my friends in a basement, talking about all kinds of different topics, sports, movies, television shows, music, and of course politics. Gradually, I started having some celebrities on the show. Former WWE champion Bob Backlund was the very first one in episode 5. On episode 24, Noam Chomsky made his first appearance on the show. And then from there, the show started getting more political, and I started having a lot more guests on. But in case any of you out there are wondering what my favorite episode of the show was, it was actually episode 49. Episode 49 of Primo Nutmeg, titled The Baseball and Politics Road Atlas, was when I took a road trip across the US the week before the 2016 election. I stopped in Cleveland and Chicago during the 2016 World Series, probably the greatest World Series of all time, when the Chicago Cubs finally won after a 108-year drought. But since it was right before the election, I also stopped and talked to a lot of different folks with a lot of different perspectives, and got their insight on why they were supporting Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, Jill Stein, or someone else. So if any of you folks out there are interested in listening to my favorite episode of the show and you haven't heard it yet, go back to episode 49 from October 2016. But again, folks, I did want to touch base with you on the latest political news. We have a lot going on. Most recently, of course, was last week's Democratic debate. There were some fireworks during the debate, namely between Tulsi Gabbard and Kamala Harris, as well as Tulsi Gabbard and Pete Buttigieg. There was also a pretty funny exchange between Cory Booker, Joe Biden, and Kamala Harris. And I really think that Cory Booker scored some points with that exchange, and of course his joke that Joe Biden seemed high. And I also think that Bernie Sanders did very well during the debate. In particular, I think that he scored a lot of foreign policy points. He reminded a lot of his supporters why he is a less hawkish option compared to the centrist Democrats out there. Most of the folks on stage, of course, say that we need to be tough on Russia, China, Iran, Syria, Venezuela, etc., etc. Bernie Sanders in this debate came off as slightly more dovish and more sane. That was, of course, contrasted with Andrew Yang. Although he didn't get much speaking time, it seemed as though most of his time was spent ranting against Russia and China, and Yang came off very, very hawkish in this debate. Although foreign policy isn't really a major issue in this election cycle, and most of Andrew Yang's supporters are really only focused on UBI, I have to think that Yang's extreme hawkishness in this debate had to cost him at least some support. But the real big takeaway from this debate, of course, was Tulsi Gabbard's performance. Early on in the debate, MSNBC seemed to try to replicate a rivalry between Tulsi and Kamala Harris.
As president, I will end this foreign policy, end these regime change wars, work to end this new Cold War and arms race, and instead invest our hard-earned taxpayer dollars actually into serving the needs of the American people right here at home.
Senator Harris, any response?
Oh, sure. I think that it's unfortunate that we have someone on the stage who is attempting to be the Democratic nominee for President of the United States, who during the Obama administration spent 4 years full-time on Fox News criticizing President Obama.
That's
who
ridiculous,
has spent full-time,
That's
who has spent
ridiculous.
full-time criticizing people on this stage as affiliated with the Democratic Party. When Donald Trump was elected, not even sworn in, buddied up to Steve Bannon to get a meeting with Donald Trump in the Trump Tower, fails to call a war criminal by what he is as a war criminal, and then spends full time during the course of this campaign, again, criticizing the Democratic Party. What we need on the stage in November is someone who has the ability to win. And by that, we need someone on that stage who has the ability to go toe-to-toe with Donald Trump, and someone who has the ability to rebuild the Obama coalition and bring the party and the nation together. I believe I am that candidate.
Thank you, Senator.
Yes.
Congresswoman Gabbard, I'll give you a chance to respond.
What Senator Harris is doing is unfortunately continuing to traffic in lies and smears and innuendos because she cannot challenge the substance of the argument that I'm making, the leadership and the change that I'm seeking to bring in our foreign policy, which only makes me guess that she will, as president, continue the status quo, continue the Bush-Clinton-Trump foreign policy of regime change wars, which is deeply destructive. This is personal to me because I served in Iraq. I left my seat in the state legislature in Hawaii, volunteered to deploy to Iraq, where I served in a medical unit where every single day I saw the terribly high human cost of war. I take very seriously the responsibility that the president has to serve as commander-in-chief, to lead our armed forces, and to make sure always, no, I'm not going to put party interests first. I will put the interests of the American people above all else.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I want to briefly give Senator Harris a final second to respond.
I believe that what our nation needs right now is a nominee who can speak to all people. I spent my entire career standing mostly in a courtroom speaking 5 words, Kamala Harris for the people. And it was about all the people, regardless of their race, regardless of their gender, regardless of where they live geographically, regardless of the party with which they're registered to vote or the language their grandmother speaks. We need someone on this debate stage in November who has the ability to unify the country and to win the election.
The whole thing seemed extremely scripted, and it really seemed embarrassing to Kamala. She didn't have much of a comeback. And I think overall, this was really just another marker of the end of Kamala Harris's campaign. Despite calling herself a top-tier candidate, she has been falling in the polls since this summer. Tulsi Gabbard, on the other hand, continues to rise. And I think it's only a matter of time before Kamala finally drops out. Now, the other big fight during the debate was between Tulsi Gabbard and Pete Buttigieg. Tulsi was the one who started this. She went after Mayor Pete for his recent remarks on sending troops to Mexico. They had a pretty good exchange. It went back and forth a bit.
But I want to get back to Pete Buttigieg and his comment about experience. Pete, you'll agree that the service that we both have provided to our country as veterans by itself does not qualify us to serve as commander-in-chief. I think the most recent example of your inexperience in national security and foreign policy came from your recent careless statement about how you as president would be willing to send our troops to Mexico to fight the cartels. As commander-in-chief, leader of our armed forces, I bring extensive experience serving for 7 years in Congress, on the Foreign Affairs Committee, on the Armed Services Committee, on the Homeland Security Committee, meeting with leaders of countries around the world, working with military commanders of different commands, dealing with high-level national security briefings, understanding what's necessary, the preparation that I've gotten to walk in on day one to serve as Commander-in-Chief.
Congresswoman, thank you. Mr. Mayor, I'll allow you to respond.
I know that it's par for the course in Washington to take remarks out of context, but that is outlandish even by the standards of today's politics.
Are you saying that you didn't say that?
I was talking about U.S.-Mexico cooperation. We've been doing security cooperation with Mexico for years, with law enforcement cooperation and a military relationship that could continue to be developed with training relationships, for example. Do you seriously think anybody on this stage is proposing invading Mexico?
That's not what I said.
I'm talking about building up alliances. And if your question is about experience, let's also talk about judgment. One of the foreign leaders you mentioned meeting was Bashar al-Assad. I have, in my experience, such as it is, whether you think it counts or not, since it wasn't accumulated in Washington, enough judgment that I would not have sat down with a murderous dictator like that.
Congresswoman Gabbard, let me allow you to respond.
Thank you. You were asked directly whether you would send our troops to Mexico to fight cartels, and your answer was yes. The fact checkers can check this out. No. But your point about judgment is absolutely correct. Our commander-in-chief does need to have good judgment. And what you've just pointed out is that you would lack the courage to meet with both adversaries and friends to ensure the peace and national security of our nation. I take the example of those leaders who have come before us, leaders like JFK, who met with Khrushchev, like Roosevelt, who met with Stalin,
like Donald Trump,
Reagan, like Reagan, who met and worked with Gorbachev. These issues of national security are incredibly important. I will meet with and do what is necessary to make sure that no more of our brothers and sisters in uniform are needlessly sent into harm's way fighting regime change wars that undermine our national security. I'll bring real leadership and experience to the White House.
I've got to respond.
Senator Sanders, I'm going to have
Buttigieg held his own, but really by repeating the same old tired smears about Tulsi Gabbard meeting with Bashar al-Assad. Tulsi made a great point about former presidents meeting with foreign adversaries. Buttigieg interrupted her and made reference to Donald Trump, once again trying to tie Tulsi Gabbard to Donald Trump, making her seem as though she's the Republican. And really, this is the most shocking thing about this, is that Democrats have now become so hawkish that they're running to the right of Donald Trump on foreign policy. One has to imagine that 10 or 15 years ago, somebody like Tulsi Gabbard would have been widely celebrated in the Democratic Party. If you think back to the Bush years and how strongly Democrats were condemning that war, how they were talking about bringing our troops home and making peace with our adversaries. If you go back to even 2012, when Barack Obama condemned Mitt Romney for saying that Russia was our #1 geopolitical foe, it seems as though Tulsi Gabbard would have been loved by that Democratic Party. But thanks to the 2016 election, and thanks to the fact that Donald Trump embraced somewhat isolationist foreign policy rhetoric, it's almost as if Democrats want to be the neoconservative party. If you look at the way that they now celebrate the Bush crime cartel, it's really shameful. And this was actually on full display after the debate.
I've got Tulsi Gabbard and I got Steve Schmidt up there that took a shot at you a while ago. I want to give him a shot. Steve, would you repeat what you said about Tulsi Gabbard?
This woman, I thought your performance was dishonest. I think your positions are extreme. And one question I would have for you is, why did you go to Syria to meet Bashar al-Assad? What was the intent of your visit there? And why were you so dishonest with regard to the mayor, insisting that he called for plans to invade Mexico, which, of course, he did not?
Tulsi.
Well, if you look at what the mayor said in response to the woman who asked him the question about Mexico, I was merely citing what the mayor responded to. Look, the commander-in-chief and the qualifications necessary to serve in that role are incredibly important.
Now, for those of you who don't know who Steve Schmidt is, here's a little bit of a recap. Steve Schmidt worked with Karl Rove back in 2004 to help re-elect war criminals George W. Bush and Dick Cheney. To some degree, he is partially responsible for helping continue the crimes of the Bush administration by helping them reach a second term. If you think about everything horrible that happened in George W. Bush's second term, the continuation of the Iraq War, the response to Hurricane Katrina, the trampling of constitutional rights, the drone war, and everything that led up to the 2008 recession, Steve Schmidt is partially responsible for all of those things because he was one of the influential people who helped re-elect George W. Bush and Dick Cheney. On top of that, Steve Schmidt also worked with John McCain in 2008, where he was the genius who recommended that McCain select Sarah Palin as a running mate. Yet despite that terrible record, Steve Schmidt is now a hatchet man working at MSNBC, where he goes after Tulsi Gabbard, someone who served in the illegal wars that he helped perpetuate by re-electing George W. Bush in 2004. Now think about the irony of that. Steve Schmidt is somebody who literally built his career working with and helping war criminals. He is condemning Tulsi Gabbard, someone who served in those illegal wars, someone who is still an active duty combat veteran, condemning her as a traitor for meeting with a foreign adversary. And this is being featured on MSNBC, a supposedly liberal left-wing network, who is attacking Tulsi Gabbard from the right and calling her a Republican. All of this boggles the mind. It's upside down, it's backwards, it's very Orwellian. Tulsi Gabbard has become a bad guy in the Democratic Party because she's reflecting the values of the Democratic Party from 15 years ago. Meanwhile, the Bush-era neoconservatives and the Romneyites, they have become the heroes of the Democratic Party in the Trump era. Beyond that, you have this elitist Pete Buttigieg, someone with a terrible record, especially if you know anything about South Bend, Indiana, and he's being propped up as the future of the Democratic Party. Now, folks, I can't quickly get into Pete Buttigieg's background. It's very complicated and very strange. His parents were professors at the University of Notre Dame. His father was actually a well-known left-wing intellectual, but Pete went to Harvard and Oxford. He was actually one of the first few hundred people on Facebook, and he recently was actually propped up by Mark Zuckerberg, appearing in some photos together. He worked at some different think tanks and also McKinsey. He was in Navy intelligence and went to Afghanistan. And then after that, he went back to South Bend, Indiana, where he was raised, where he has served as mayor for the past few years. Now, folks, I don't know how many of you actually have ever been to South Bend, Indiana, but it is a deeply troubled city. Prior to the 1960s, it was home to the famous car, the Studebaker. But when the Studebaker went out of business, South Bend, Indiana really suffered. They've been dealing with poverty for decades. But because South Bend is also the home to the University of Notre Dame, it's a very, very stratified city. There's many wealthy families who live around the university, yet much of the city suffers from deep poverty. There's also a lot of problems with infrastructure. The roads in South Bend are absolutely terrible. And there's also problems with the police force and with institutional racism in the city. This has come up recently when South Bend Councilman Oliver Davis, who is the longest serving African American man on the city's Common Council, endorsed Joe Biden over Pete Buttigieg, which is really big news, especially if you think about how important it might be for South Bend to have its mayor become president of the United States. And after that, Michael Harriot wrote a scathing piece in The Root called "Pete Buttigieg is a Lying MF." This article centers primarily on a 2011 television piece featuring Pete Buttigieg, where he said that kids from lower income minority neighborhoods don't have someone they know personally who testifies to the value of education. This is further complicated by a tweet that Pete Buttigieg put out about the same time, where he tweeted out a story about the Springfield, Massachusetts police using Green Beret tactics. In the tweet, Pete Buttigieg said, quote, "Interesting use of counterinsurgency tactics to address gang violence dovetails with community policing strategy," end quote. All of this is to say, of course, that Pete Buttigieg does not really have a record to run on. It's a very strange situation where he's being propped up as the future of the Democratic Party, but he doesn't really seem to have much of a record. One has to wonder what kind of ties he might have that are helping boost him in the race, as he really does seem like the ultimate AstroTurf candidate. Now, folks, it's important for all of us to remember that we do need to make sure that we are registered to vote in the upcoming primaries. Everything that's been happening up to now has really just been based on polls or debate performances or who's announced. Recently, Michael Bloomberg announced that he's running, which is really interesting since, again, he is a Bush-era neoconservative. He endorsed George W. Bush for president, appeared at the Republican National Convention.
The president deserves our support. We are here to support him. And I am here to support him.
But now he is going to be a major player in the 2020 Democratic primaries. So it's important for all of us to make sure that you are registered to vote. In closed primary states, you have to register as a Democrat in order to vote in the Democratic primaries. So please make sure that you're registered, and please also get involved with your candidate's campaign, volunteer, donate, do everything that you can to support that candidate. Also, it's important not to worry about hurting one candidate because you're supporting another. This has come up a lot recently in the conversations between Tulsi Gabbard supporters and Bernie Sanders supporters. What's important at this stage in the game is that everyone supports the candidate who best represents their views. I've seen a lot of arguments from Bernie Sanders supporters saying that Tulsi Gabbard is going to hurt Bernie. From my perspective, this is a very specious argument, especially if you look back to 2016, when Tulsi Gabbard resigned as vice chair of the DNC in order to support Bernie Sanders. One has to think that if Tulsi does not win the nomination, that she would support Bernie. This, of course, would be the exact opposite from Elizabeth Warren, who endorsed Hillary Clinton in 2016 over Bernie Sanders. But regardless, it's important to support the candidate who best represents your views. That is what the primary is about. There are lots of neoliberals all running on the same campaigns, all saying the same things, and splitting up that vote. If you're more concerned about domestic policies and student loan forgiveness and workplace democracy and a guaranteed jobs program, then Bernie Sanders is probably your person. If you're more concerned about foreign policy and ending the quote-unquote regime change wars, as well as the support for UBI, then Tulsi Gabbard is probably your person. Now, I've heard some Bernie Sanders supporters make the case that although Tulsi is better on foreign policy, Bernie is the one who's more likely to win, and therefore Tulsi supporters should get behind him. Now, there's a couple different arguments you can make against that perspective. One is that if you look at the history of what presidents are usually blocked on, it seems more often than not it is domestic policy. As commander-in-chief, the president usually has more control over what the armed forces do, yet because legislation has to be passed in Congress to achieve domestic policy goals, it can be harder sometimes for presidents to achieve those goals. But at the end of the day, what I think is really a good thing happening here is the dynamic between Bernie Sanders and Tulsi Gabbard. When you have two progressive candidates running, they end up competing with each other to become more progressive. And this was featured recently in what happened with Tulsi Gabbard being a little late to call what happened in Bolivia recently a coup. Now, Bernie Sanders, to his credit, came out early, said it was a coup, and he was absolutely right. It took Tulsi a long time to come out and call it a coup. Eventually she did. She had strong language, but it took her a while. And one wonders, had Bernie not been first, and had Tulsi's supporters not been so vocal about her following suit behind Bernie, well, one wonders how Tulsi's statements might have been a little bit different. And you also saw this earlier this year with Julian Assange, when Tulsi Gabbard came out first strongly in support of Julian Assange. It took Bernie several weeks, but eventually in a tweet he alluded to Julian Assange and seemed at least more supportive than other candidates out there who want to prosecute Assange. The point being that in a primary, this is really where we can help move the party in the right direction. This should be self-evident, but it's worth repeating. On some issues, Bernie Sanders is better. On some issues, Tulsi Gabbard is better. They're different candidates, they think differently, they prioritize things differently, and because of that, sometimes one is better on a given issue and sometimes the other is better on a given issue. But what's good in a primary is that we can hold Bernie's feet to the fire vis-a-vis Tulsi, and we can hold Tulsi's feet to the fire vis-a-vis Bernie. And if Tulsi wins the nomination, she won't be perfect, but hopefully most Bernie Sanders supporters will get behind her. Just like if Bernie ends up winning the nomination, hopefully most Tulsi Gabbard supporters will get behind him. Again, neither candidate is perfect, but they're both head and shoulders above every other Democrat running. So for that reason, please do register, please do get involved with these campaigns, and let's move both candidates in the right direction. Now, folks, the last thing that I want to talk about on the show today was actually about third-party candidates. And I came across an article recently by Michael Scherer in the Washington Post, and it's a really interesting article because you would think that Michael must listen to this show, because in this article titled, "Will Democrats Face a Third-Party Problem Again?" he talks about Jesse Ventura possibly running as a Green, something that Jesse talked about when he was on this show. So will you ever run for president? Will you seek the Green Party nomination?
I don't know. You'll find out in the spring.
Okay.
Why would I do it now? Wait till the Pipers are gone.
Okay. Well, Governor,
it's all about tactics, man. It's tactics. That's how you win. It ain't time now. It's too early.
I sincerely hope that you do run for president this year, and
Yeah.
I think it would be awesome if you did.
Well, let me just leave you with this. What do you think about a ticket? Imagine this ticket. Governor Jesse Ventura and Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
That sounds great. I would love to see that.
He quits the Democratic Party and joins me with the Greens.
Let's make it happen. Again, Jill Stein isn't running this year, so the Libertarian, the Green Party is having a contentious.
Don't hold your breath, but it's far too early. You got to at least get in the year of the election before you worry about that stuff.
And he also talks about the fact that Jill Stein urged Tulsi Gabbard to run as a third-party candidate. That happened on this show, and actually, I am the person who conveyed Jill Stein's request that Tulsi Gabbard run to Tulsi Gabbard. Another candidate that is getting a lot of grassroots interest right now is Tulsi Gabbard. And the things that she has said, I personally find, amazing that there's a candidate out there saying them. And she talks about how neoliberals and neoconservatives in both parties collude to bring us into regime change wars, that we're in a new Cold War. I think she's used the term military-industrial complex. She's quoted Noam Chomsky. And it's really shocking, and obviously, there's been a backlash from the party and from the corporate media because of that. If it was somehow possible for her to win the Democratic nomination, would she be a candidate worth voting for?
These are big hypotheticals.
Sure.
Personally, I find her comments to be very on point and very similar with our message, in 2016 and 2012 and going back, and it's really great that someone, and comparable to Dennis Kucinich, what she's saying is what I think any really informed and honest observer would have to say, so like we're shocked. We're shocked that the system allows, a little reality check in it. That is absolutely shocking. I can't really get my hopes up. I'm very concerned with building a real system of integrity that's not going to get wiped out in this election, that's not going to get wiped out by a party that opposes it, which was my summary of what I thought about Sanders' campaign, which is that you can't have a revolution in a counter-revolutionary party. It's just not going to happen. We really have to build, a political structure for transformation. And I think she should become a Green, and I think that would be really magical, and that would really be powerful and would make change in a way that can't be beaten back. She might not win the election, but that way, we would build a really firm base.
I also had Jill Stein on the show and some Green Party candidates that are running in the 2020 election. And she and someone else had mentioned that they might like you to run with the Green Party. Is that something that you would ever consider, or are you dead set on supporting the Democratic nominee, whoever that might be?
Yeah, I'm not going to run as a third-party candidate or as an independent. The reality is that our country has a two-party system right now, and frankly, it's not viable to think that a third-party candidate in this day and age will be able to be successful in that election. My energy is I've always been a Democrat, and my energy is focused on being the Democratic nominee, being in that position where I can be the president and leading our party towards bringing about the kinds of reforms that it needs, rooting out the corruption within our own party, and making it so that the Democratic Party truly represents the interests of the people and our planet.
But beyond these seeming references to this show, what's interesting in this article is the fact that it seems to paint all third parties and all possible third-party candidates as possible Russian dupes. For example, the article says, quote, Ventura, the one-time professional wrestler who hosts a news and commentary show on the Russian-backed media network RT, said he is interested in the Green Party nomination, though he is not taking any steps to secure it. Later on in the article it says, quote, Ventura, for his part, argues that he has a route to the Green Party nomination despite his lack of plans to campaign anytime soon. Splitting his time between Minnesota and an off-the-grid house in Mexico, Ventura has his own take on Russia and President Vladimir Putin, whom he says he met in Moscow at a December 2015 dinner sponsored by the RT network. Quote, he said, I will never intervene in your show creatively or artistically. You have your own show. And he is a man of his word, Ventura recalled, referring to his program, The World According to Jesse. Quote, I take personal offense when I am told that I am an arm of the Kremlin. How dare you, mainstream media? Ventura has become a booster of closer relations between Russia and the United States. He said it is not acceptable for a foreign nation to interfere in U.S. elections, but he celebrated the release of internal Democratic Party emails during the 2016 campaign, which U.S. intelligence officials blame on a Russian hack. Quote, I came out publicly and said, if what they say was true, we should thank the messenger, end quote, Ventura said. Now, in this same article, Scherer makes note of the Libertarian Party and even the Constitution Party. And really, overall, it just seems like a big fear campaign against anyone who might consider running as a third-party candidate. And unfortunately, this is what's going to happen to anybody who becomes the nominee of the Green Party, the Libertarian Party, the Constitution Party, or who runs as a non-neoliberal independent. The irony, of course, is wondering what happens if either Bernie Sanders or Tulsi Gabbard wins the Democratic Party nomination. Imagine it's next November, and the choice is either between Donald Trump and Tulsi Gabbard. Who is Rachel Maddow going to vote for? It seems likely that at that point, Bloomberg or someone else will run as a third party or independent candidate, and that centrists would gladly leave the Democratic Party. This actually happened in Connecticut back in 2006. It was that year that Ned Lamont, who is now the governor of Connecticut, defeated incumbent Senator Joe Lieberman in the Democratic primary. What happened at that point? Well, Joe decided to set up his own party, Connecticut for Lieberman, and thanks to the support of pro-war centrists, he was reelected in the general election that fall in the deep blue state of Connecticut. Now, it's hard to say if that would play out the same way on a national scale. It's hard to say really how many loyal neoliberals there are in the Democratic Party. It seems to just be an elite class of media intelligentsia and political insiders, but who knows? We have 1 year until the election, and things are going to get interesting. Once again, folks, I encourage all of you to get involved this year. It's going to be a big election, it's going to be historic, and it's really going to set the trajectory for the future of our country. So with that, folks, I want to wish you all a very happy Thanksgiving. Please do enjoy the holiday, spend time with your family, talk about things besides politics, and really spend the holiday meditating on everything that you're thankful for. I know I will. Thanks again for listening, folks, and I'll catch you on the next episode of Primo Nutmeg.